6 months of deception delivered in a single phone call on a Wednesday morning. That is how friendship dies. Not with dramatic confrontation or public scene, but with stammered apology and the sick realization that two people you trusted had been conspiring against you for half a year. The voice on the other end belonged to Gregory Ashworth, someone Thaddeus Fleming had considered one of his closest friends in Chiang Mai. The words Gregory spoke were halting, guilt-soaked, delivered with the kind of performative remorse that made Thaddeus wonder whether the confession was meant to ease Gregory's conscience rather than address any real concern for the damage caused. Malai had been sleeping with Gregory since March. It was now September. 6 months of lies, 6 months of looking Thaddeus in the eye while betraying him behind his back. 6 months of calculated deception that made every memory suspect and every conversation retroactively poisonous. Thaddeus Fleming had always prided himself on his rational mind. 65 years of life had taught him to approach problems systematically, to gather evidence before drawing conclusions, to trust logic over emotion. His career as a high school mathematics teacher in suburban Maryland had reinforced this tendency. For 38 years, he had taught students to value proof over assumption, to show their work, to arrive at conclusions through demonstrable reasoning rather than intuition. When he retired at 63 and moved to Thailand on his pension and modest savings, he had applied the same methodical approach to building a new life. He researched visa options thoroughly, compared cost of living in various Thai cities, created spreadsheets analyzing monthly expenses versus income. Chiang Mai made logical sense. Lower cost than Bangkok or the islands, better air quality than industrial centers, established expat community providing social infrastructure. The decision had been rational, data-driven, sensible. Meeting Malai had not been rational at all. Thaddeus had been in Chiang Mai for 8 months when he first saw her at a small cafe near Tha Pei Gate. She was serving tables, moving between customers with efficient grace, her English functional though accented. He had been reading a book on Thai history, occasionally glancing up to watch the street life pass by the open-air seating area. She had refilled his coffee without asking, noticed his book, commented that she found history boring but respected people who could read such thick books. Her smile had been genuine, or at least appeared genuine, which Thaddeus would later understand was the entire problem. Appearance of genuineness and actual genuineness were not the same thing, though his logical mind had failed to maintain that distinction when confronted with her attention. Their courtship followed a pattern Thaddeus recognized as typical for Western men and Thai service workers, though he convinced himself their situation was somehow different, somehow special. She gave him her line contact after his third visit to the cafe. They messaged casually for a week before he suggested dinner at a proper restaurant. She agreed, but seemed nervous, which Thaddeus interpreted as appropriate caution rather than calculation about how to play the situation. The dinner went well. She told him about her family in Lamphan province, about her father who had died when she was 12, about her mother and younger brother who depended partially on money she sent home each month. She asked about his life, seemed fascinated by his teaching career, laughed at his self-deprecating jokes about being a boring mathematics instructor. When he offered to pay for a taxi home, She accepted but did not ask for additional money. This had reassured him. She was not immediately extracting cash. Therefore, she must be interested in him as a person rather than a resource. The logic was flawed. Thaddeus would later recognize. The fact that she did not ask for money on the first date proved nothing except that she understood how to play a longer game. But at the time, his rational mind had seized on this as evidence supporting his preferred conclusion. He wanted to believe this attractive 27-year-old woman was genuinely interested in a 65-year-old retired teacher. So he constructed a logical framework that justified that belief. She was mature for her age. She valued stability over excitement. She had dated Thai men before and found them unreliable or unfaithful. She appreciated his intelligence, his kindness, his willingness to listen. All of these explanations were plausible, and Thaddeus arranged them into a coherent narrative that made their relationship make sense. They became exclusive after 6 weeks. This had been his suggestion, delivered over dinner at a northern Thai restaurant in the old city. He told her he was not interested in casual dating at his age, that if they were going to continue seeing each other, he wanted commitment from both sides. Malai had seemed surprised by this conversation, but agreed after what appeared to be genuine consideration. She told him she had been hurt before by men who made promises they did not keep, so she wanted to take things slowly. But yes, she was willing to be exclusive. They sealed the agreement with a toast, and Thaddeus remembered feeling a surge of satisfaction at having approached this like an adult, with clear communication and mutual understanding. It was all very logical, very mature, very unlike the messy, emotional entanglements he had witnessed among younger couples. The sex started that night, back at his apartment in a quiet development near Hui Keu Road. Thaddeus had not expected this, had not planned for it, but Malai had initiated with a directness that surprised and pleased him. She was enthusiastic, responsive, apparently enjoying herself as much as he was. Afterward, lying in his bed with the ceiling fan rotating slowly above them, she had told him she felt safe with him. Safe was a word she would use frequently over the 19 months of their relationship. She felt safe from financial instability, safe from the judgment of Thai society regarding her service job, safe from the volatility she claimed characterized her previous relationships. Thaddeus had felt proud to provide this safety, to be the stable, mature man who could offer security that younger or less reliable men could not. His ego had been thoroughly stroked, though he would not recognize this dynamic until much later. Gregory Ashworth entered the picture about 4 months into the relationship. Thaddeus had met him at an expat coffee morning, one of those regular gatherings where foreign residents of Chiang Mai congregated to complain about visa runs and exchange recommendations for dentists and mechanics. Gregory was British, early 60s, divorced, living in Thailand for the past 7 years on a retirement visa. He had worked in finance before retiring, had 2 adult children back in the UK who rarely visited, and spent his time in Chiang Mai cycling, attending language classes, and involving himself in various expat social activities. He and Thaddeus had hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared statuses as recently retired men, attempting to build meaningful lives in a foreign country. They started meeting regularly for breakfast, taking day trips to temples and waterfalls, attending events together when their schedules aligned. Thaddeus had introduced Gregory to Malai about a month after they became friends. The three of them had dinner together at a restaurant Gregory recommended, a place serving fusion cuisine that catered to foreign tastes. Gregory had been charming and appropriate, asking Malai polite questions about her work and family, without the condescension that some expats displayed toward Thai service workers. Malai had seemed to enjoy his company, laughing at his jokes, asking him about life in Britain, playing the role of gracious girlfriend. At the time, Thaddeus had felt pleased that his friend and his girlfriend got along well. It made social activities easier, reduced the potential awkwardness of navigating separate social spheres. Looking back, he could pinpoint this dinner as the beginning of the betrayal, though he had no way of knowing it then. The first 6 months of the relationship were, by Thaddeus's assessment, genuinely good. Malai stayed over 3 or 4 nights a week, enough to feel like a real relationship, but not so much that he felt suffocated. She continued working at the cafe, which he respected as evidence of her work ethic and independence. She contributed to groceries when she stayed over, refused to let him pay for everything despite his greater financial resources. They fell into comfortable routines. She would cook Thai food he had never tried, teaching him the names of ingredients and preparation techniques. He would help her practice English, correcting her grammar gently, encouraging her to read more. They watched movies together, walked around the old city, took weekend trips to Pai and Mae Hong Son. It felt, for those months, like a genuine partnership between two adults who enjoyed each other's company. The warning signs started around month 7, which coincided with when Gregory and Malai had apparently begun their affair, though Thaddeus would not know this until the confession months later. Malai became slightly less available, citing increased hours at the cafe and additional family obligations that required her attention. When they were together, she seemed distracted, checking her phone more frequently, sometimes smiling at messages in a way that suggested private jokes or conversations. Thaddeus noticed these changes, but applied his logical mind to explaining them away. Increased work hours meant she was being responsible and ambitious. Family obligations were normal in Thai culture, where extended family support was expected. Phone usage was ubiquitous among young people. Nothing unusual about staying connected to her social circle. But beneath the rational explanations, something bothered him. Not enough to voice directly, but enough to create a low-level anxiety that persisted despite his efforts to logic it away. Thaddeus found himself checking how often she looked at her phone during dinner. He noticed she had started putting her phone face down on tables, something she had not done before. She took calls outside or in the bathroom, claiming the connection was better or she did not want to disturb him. Small changes, individually explainable, but accumulating into a pattern his subconscious recognized, even as his conscious mind rejected the implications. Gregory, during this same period, became an increasingly present figure in their lives. He joined them for dinners more frequently. He suggested group activities, day trips where the three of them would explore together. He was always friendly, always appropriate in his interactions with Malai, but he also had opportunities to interact with her separately. Sometimes Thaddeus would arrive at a restaurant to find Gregory and Malai already there, chatting comfortably while waiting for him. Sometimes plans would change and Thaddeus would be delayed, leaving Gregory and Malai alone for extended periods. At the time, these situations seemed innocuous, even positive evidence of how well his different social spheres were integrating. In retrospect, they were opportunities for the affair to develop and deepen without his awareness. Around month 10, Thaddeus proposed that Malai move in with him. It was a logical next step, he argued. She was staying over most nights anyway. She could save money by giving up her small room in a shared house. They were both committed to the relationship, so why maintain the fiction of separate residences? Malai had hesitated, which surprised him. She cited concerns about propriety, about what her family would think, about whether they were moving too fast. Thaddeus had not pushed, respecting her need to feel comfortable with the decision. She agreed instead to keep some clothes and toiletries at his place, a compromise that allowed her to stay over without officially moving in. This had seemed reasonable at the time. Looking back, Thaddeus realized she had needed to maintain her separate space as a base for her affair with Gregory, a place she could claim to be when she was actually elsewhere. The phone became a major source of tension around month 12. Malai had always been relatively open with her phone, occasionally showing Thaddeus funny messages or photos her friends had sent. Then suddenly her phone acquired a password. When Thaddeus asked about this casually, she had responded with surprising defensiveness. Privacy was important, she said. Just because they were in a relationship did not mean he was entitled to read all her messages. It was about principle, about maintaining boundaries. It's about not becoming one of those couples who had no individual identity, all of which sounded logical and healthy. And Thaddeus had backed down immediately, apologizing for being nosy and controlling. But the incident bothered him. Not the password itself, but the vehemence of her reaction, the way she had immediately framed his casual question as an attack on her autonomy. Gregory, around this time, started asking Thaddeus pointed questions about the relationship. How were things going with Malai? Was Thaddeus happy? Did he ever worry about the age gap or cultural differences? At first, these questions seemed like normal friend concern, the kind of check-ins that close friends do for each other. But something about Gregory's tone suggested more than casual interest. He seemed almost to be probing, testing how much Thaddeus suspected, how secure Thaddeus felt in the relationship. When Thaddeus mentioned Malai's increased phone security, Gregory had suggested this was normal behavior, that Thaddeus should not read too much into it, that young people valued their digital privacy. The reassurance had been welcome, even as part of Thaddeus's mind wondered why Gregory was so quick to defend behavior that seemed suspicious. Month 14 brought more obvious changes. Malai started canceling plans with increasing frequency. A family emergency required her to go home for the weekend. A friend was having a crisis and needed her support. Work had scheduled her for unexpected extra shifts. Each cancellation came with a detailed explanation, the kind of elaborate story that should have been reassuring, but instead raised flags, precisely because of its completeness. Liars, Thaddeus knew from his years of teaching, tended to over-explain. They provided too much detail, constructed too perfect narratives, anticipated questions before they were asked. Yet, knowing this intellectually did not help him recognize it in real time when applied to someone he loved. The sex also changed during this period. Less frequent, less enthusiastic, sometimes almost perfunctory. Malai cited stress, fatigue, hormonal issues. She was still affectionate in other ways, still cuddled and kissed and held hands, but the sexual dimension of their relationship had noticeably cooled. Thaddeus tried not to take this personally, reminding himself that relationships naturally settled into less passionate phases, that his age might be a factor, that stress could definitely impact libido. But another part of him wondered whether she was getting sexual satisfaction elsewhere, whether the cooling toward him reflected warming towards someone else. Around month 16, another expat named Chen pulled Thaddeus aside at a social function. Chen was Taiwanese, had lived in Chiang Mai for over a decade, and had a reputation for knowing all the expat gossip. He told Thaddeus, with obvious discomfort, that he had seen Malai at a restaurant with another foreign man, and they had seemed very friendly. Not just friendly like friends, but friendly like a couple. Lots of touching, leaning close, the kind of body language that suggested intimacy. Thaddeus had thanked Chen for the information while simultaneously dismissing it. The man was probably a friend, or a work connection, or something innocuous that Chen had misinterpreted. Malai had many foreign customers at the cafe, who she was friendly with. This meant nothing, except it probably meant everything, and Thaddeus had known this on some level, even as he rejected the knowledge. His logical mind was being used defensively now, constructing explanations that protected him from painful truth rather than leading him toward it. Every suspicious behavior received a rational explanation. Every inconsistency was smoothed over with the application of reasonable alternative interpretations. Thaddeus had always believed his intelligence was an asset, but in this situation it became a liability. He was too good at constructing plausible alternative narratives, too skilled at finding logical explanations that allowed him to avoid confronting emotionally difficult possibilities. The conversation with Gregory that ultimately led to the confession happened on a Tuesday evening. Thaddeus and Gregory met for dinner at a small restaurant near the Ping River, just the two of them, as Malai claimed she needed to work late. Gregory had seemed agitated throughout the meal, drinking more than usual, steering conversation away from anything meaningful. Thaddeus had attributed this to stress about visa renewal issues Gregory had mentioned previously. After dinner, walking back toward where they had parked motorcycles, Gregory had stopped abruptly and asked whether Thaddeus was happy with Malai. The question was so direct, so serious in tone, that Thaddeus immediately went on alert. He said yes, of course he was happy. Why would Gregory ask that? Gregory had shaken his head, started to say something, then stopped himself. He said never mind. He was just checking. He cared about Thaddeus and wanted to make sure he was doing all right. The conversation had ended there, but Thaddeus went home with a sick feeling in his stomach that he could not logic away. 3 days later, on Wednesday morning, while Thaddeus was having coffee on his balcony, his phone rang. Gregory, calling at 8 in the morning, which was unusual. Thaddeus answered, expecting to hear about plans for the weekend or a question about some practical matter. Instead, he heard Gregory's voice, thick with emotion, asking whether Thaddeus was sitting down. That is never how good news is delivered. Thaddeus said he was sitting what was wrong, and Gregory, after a long pause that stretched into painful eternity, said he needed to tell Thaddeus something. He had been carrying guilt for months and could not do it anymore. He and Malai had been involved. Involved, that bloodless term that could mean so many things, but only really meant one. They had been sleeping together since March. The words landed without immediate impact, like a blow that takes a moment before the pain registers. Thaddeus heard himself asking Gregory to repeat what he had just said, even though he had heard perfectly clearly the first time. Gregory repeated it. He and Malai had been having an affair since March. 6 months. It had started after one of their group dinners, when Malai had messaged Gregory asking for advice about a problem with her phone. They had met for coffee. The conversation had turned personal. One thing had led to another. It had continued since then. They met once or twice a week, sometimes more. Gregory was calling now because his conscience could not tolerate the deception anymore. Because Thaddeus deserved to know the truth. Because their friendship meant too much to continue lying. Thaddeus sat on his balcony, phone pressed to his ear, listening to Gregory provide details he had not asked for and did not want. They met at Gregory's condo, usually, when Thaddeus thought Malai was at work or with family. Sometimes they met at hotels. Gregory had given her money sometimes. Not payment exactly, but help with her mother's medical bills, things like that. The sex had been good, but Gregory felt terrible afterward every time. He had tried to end it multiple times, but Malai kept pulling him back in. She claimed she had feelings for him, that the relationship with Thaddeus was comfortable, but not passionate, that she needed something Gregory provided that Thaddeus could not. Gregory wanted Thaddeus to know this was not his fault, that Thaddeus had done nothing wrong, that Malai was the one who pursued the affair after Gregory made a single mistake in responding to her initial advance. The apology that followed was extensive and seemed rehearsed. Gregory was sorry, so sorrier than he could express. He valued Thaddeus's friendship more than anything, and could not live with this secret anymore. He hoped Thaddeus could eventually forgive him, though he understood if that was impossible. He would understand if Thaddeus never wanted to speak to him again. He just needed Thaddeus to know the truth because Thaddeus deserved truth, deserved to make decisions based on reality rather than lies. Thaddeus said nothing through most of this. He sat on his balcony, watching a gecko hunt insects on the ceiling, his coffee growing cold in his hand, his brain refusing to process the information being delivered. When Gregory finally stopped talking and asked whether Thaddeus was still there, Thaddeus said yes. Gregory asked what he was thinking. Thaddeus said he did not know. Gregory asked whether there was anything he could do. Thaddeus said no. The conversation ended with Gregory saying again how sorry he was, and Thaddeus ending the call without responding to the apology. The numbness that settled over Thaddeus in the minutes following that phone call was unlike anything he had experienced before. Not anger, not grief, not even surprise, really. Just a vast empty feeling, as if some essential part of him had been scooped out and replaced with void. He sat on the balcony for 2 hours without moving, watching the city wake up below him, his mind simultaneously racing and blank. 6 months. Half a year of deception involving not one person but 2 people he had trusted. His girlfriend and his friend, coordinating lies, making time for each other while maintaining performances for his benefit. Every dinner together had been a theater production. Every casual interaction loaded with subtext he had missed. Every time Gregory asked about the relationship, he had been gathering intelligence to share with Malai, or measuring how much Thaddeus suspected. When Thaddeus finally moved, it was to call Malai. She answered after several rings, her voice bright and cheerful, asking how he was doing this morning. He told her he needed to see her immediately. She said she was at work. Could it wait until evening? He said no, it could not wait. She needed to come to his apartment now. Something in his tone must have communicated seriousness, because she agreed without further questions. Said she would tell her manager it was an emergency. Be there in 30 minutes. She arrived in 25 minutes, slightly out of breath from rushing. She found Thaddeus sitting on the sofa, still wearing the same clothes from when he woke up. His coffee mug empty on the table beside him. She asked what was wrong. Was he feeling all right? Did he need her to take him to the hospital? Her concern seemed genuine, which made everything worse. How could someone perform her care so convincingly while betraying him so completely? Thaddeus looked at her, standing there in her cafe uniform, hair pulled back in a ponytail, face arranged in an expression of worried affection, and felt nothing. The numbness had expanded to fill every space inside him where emotion should have lived. He told her Gregory had called. Her face did something complicated, a micro-expression of fear, before settling back into confusion. She asked what Gregory had wanted. Thaddeus said Gregory had confessed to their affair. The affair they had been conducting since March. The affair that had apparently been going on for 6 months, while she smiled at Thaddeus and accepted his money, and slept in his bed and performed the role of faithful girlfriend. He recited these facts in a flat monotone, as if reading from a particularly uninteresting textbook. His voice showed no anger, no hurt, just statement of facts that happened to be devastating. Malai went through several responses in rapid succession. First, confusion. What was he talking about? What affair? Then denial. Gregory was lying. He had hit on her once, and she rejected him. And maybe this was revenge for that rejection? Then, when Thaddeus simply stared at her with dead eyes, not engaging with her explanations, she pivoted to minimization. Okay, something had happened with Gregory, but it was just once, months ago. It meant nothing. Then, seeing this was not working either, she shifted to blame. Thaddeus was always busy with his friends, always treating her like a child, never fully available emotionally. Gregory paid attention to her, made her feel desired, gave her something Thaddeus could not provide. And finally, when none of her strategies penetrated the numb wall Thaddeus had erected, she started crying. She was sorry, so sorry. She never meant to hurt him. It was a mistake that spiraled out of control. She loved Thaddeus and wanted to fix this. Through all of this, Thaddeus said nothing. He watched her performance with the detached interest of an observer studying an experiment. This was fascinating in its way. He was watching someone he thought he knew reveal that he had never known her at all. Every expression, every gesture, every tone of voice designed to manipulate his response, to find an opening that would allow her to regain control of the narrative. But he gave her nothing to work with. No anger for her to deflect, no hurt for her to soothe, No questions for her to spin into more elaborate lies. Just blank observation. Eventually, she ran out of strategies and sat on the opposite end of the sofa, crying quietly. She asked what he wanted her to say. He said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would change the facts. She asked what happened next. He said she should pack up the things she kept at his apartment and leave. She asked whether they could talk about this, try to work through it, maybe with counseling. He said no. The relationship was over. She had been having sex with his friend for 6 months while lying to him daily. There was nothing to work through. She protested that 6 months sounded more extensive than it was. It had not been consistent. There were weeks when nothing happened. Thaddeus pointed out this was not the defense she seemed to think it was. She tried several more approaches. She offered to cut off all contact with Gregory. She suggested they could move to a different city, start fresh where reminders of the betrayal were not present. She promised she would be completely transparent going forward, give him all passwords, let him track her location, whatever he needed to rebuild trust. When none of this generated response, she switched to anger. He was being unreasonable, refusing to even discuss possibilities, making unilateral decisions about their relationship. Relationships required forgiveness, required work from both people, required willingness to move past mistakes. By simply ending things, he was taking the coward's way out, avoiding the difficult emotional labor of genuine partnership. Thaddeus listened to this accusation with something like interest. It was remarkable how she could transform her sustained betrayal into his failure of relationship commitment. The audacity was almost impressive. He told her he would give her 20 minutes to collect her belongings, and then he wanted her to leave. She said they were not done talking. He said they were completely done talking. She said he could not just throw away 19 months over one mistake. He said it was not one mistake. It was hundreds of mistakes compounded over 6 months. Hundreds of moments where she chose to lie. Hundreds of opportunities to end the affair where she chose to continue it. She said he was counting wrong, being deliberately cruel in his accounting. He said she could leave voluntarily, or he could call building security to escort her out. The choice was hers. She left voluntarily, stuffing clothes and toiletries into a bag with shaking hands, crying throughout. She paused at the door and asked whether he would ever be able to forgive her. He said he did not know, but it did not matter, because forgiveness would not result in relationship continuation. She asked whether he was going to contact her family, tell them what happened, ruin her reputation in her village. He said no. Her relationship with her family was her concern, not his. She asked whether they could remain friends eventually, once emotions settled. He said no. She asked whether there was anything she could do to change his mind. He said no. She left crying, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed anticlimactic given the magnitude of what had just ended. After she left, Thaddeus sat in the silence of his apartment and felt nothing in particular. His rational mind catalogued facts. The relationship he thought he had never existed. For 6 months at minimum, possibly longer, Malai had been maintaining a sexual relationship with another man while accepting Thaddeus's financial support and emotional investment. His friend, Gregory, had betrayed him with full knowledge of what he was doing, had sat across from Thaddeus at countless dinners lying through his teeth, had extracted information about the relationship to share with Malai. Both of them had treated him as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a person deserving honesty and respect. These were facts, verifiable, undeniable. His emotional response to these facts was conspicuously absent. Over the following days, Thaddeus waited for feelings to arrive. Anger seemed appropriate, but did not materialize. Grief over the lost relationship, sadness over wasted time, and emotional investment. These also failed to manifest. He existed in a state of profound disconnection, going through daily routines mechanically. He made coffee, ate meals, answered emails from family members asking how he was enjoying Thailand. He told no one what had happened. When expats asked about Malai, he said simply that they were no longer together, did not elaborate, changed the subject. When Gregory tried to call 3 times in 2 days, Thaddeus did not answer. When Gregory sent a long text message saying they needed to talk about what happened, Thaddeus blocked his number without responding. The numbness concerned him after a week. He had taught psychology as an elective and understood that emotional shutdown in response to trauma was a protective mechanism, but also potentially problematic if it persisted too long. Feelings were supposed to be processed, not suppressed indefinitely. Yet no matter how many times he told himself he should feel angry or hurt or betrayed, the actual emotions refused to arrive. He went about his life in Thailand, feeling like he was watching someone else's existence from a distance. Nothing touched him. Nothing mattered enough to generate real emotional response. 2 weeks after the confession, Chen approached him at a coffee shop and asked whether he knew that Malai and Gregory were now seeing each other openly. They had been spotted together multiple times around Chiang Mai, no longer making any effort to hide their relationship. Chen seemed angry on Thaddeus's behalf, ranting about how shameless they were, how disrespectful to flaunt their relationship so quickly after the breakup. Thaddeus listened politely and said it did not bother him. Chen looked baffled. How could it not bother him? Thaddeus said he genuinely did not care what Malai and Gregory did. They were no longer part of his life. Their actions were irrelevant to him. Chen pressed the issue, said he knew Thaddeus must be hurting inside even if he was not showing it. Thaddeus said no, actually he was not hurting. He was not feeling much of anything. This troubled Chen enough that he suggested Thaddeus talk to someone, a therapist perhaps, because this level of emotional detachment after such a significant betrayal was not healthy. Thaddeus thanked him for the concern, but did not follow the advice. He was functional, after all. He was eating, sleeping reasonably well, maintaining his apartment, engaging in social activities. The absence of emotional pain seemed like an advantage rather than a problem. Why would he seek to feel worse? Around week 3, Thaddeus started cataloging all the signs he had missed or explained away. This became an obsessive project, filling hours of time that he might have previously spent with Malai. The phone password in month 12, which had been the most obvious red flag, he ignored. The increased cancellations starting around month 14. The cooling of sexual enthusiasm. The times she had said she was at work when she was presumably with Gregory. The moments during group dinners when Gregory and Malai had shared looks or inside jokes that Thaddeus had interpreted as them simply being comfortable with each other rather than concealing an affair. Every instance was now recontextualized, every memory poisoned with the knowledge of betrayal. What frustrated Thaddeus most was recognizing how his logical mind had been weaponized against his own interests. He had used his intelligence to construct explanations that protected him from painful truth. When evidence of infidelity appeared, he had applied rational analysis to explain it away rather than accept its implications. He had trusted in his ability to understand patterns, to gather data and draw accurate conclusions. But he had drawn conclusions that served his emotional needs rather than reflecting reality. His fatal flaw, he realized, was not stupidity or gullibility. It was the arrogant belief that his logical mind could reliably interpret human behavior. That reason could fully account for people's actions and motivations. He had treated the relationship like a math problem that could be solved with sufficient analysis, failing to recognize that humans operated on emotional and strategic levels that defied logical prediction. The confession itself bothered Thaddeus when he analyzed it. Gregory had framed his revelation as an act of conscience, as though he deserved credit for eventually telling the truth after 6 months of sustained lying. But the timing suggested other motives. Perhaps the affair was becoming difficult to maintain. Perhaps Malai was pushing for something Gregory was unwilling to provide. Perhaps he feared Thaddeus would discover the truth through other means and wanted to control the narrative. The confession served Gregory's interests, allowing him to position himself as the remorseful friend who valued honesty over the woman who had apparently seduced him away from loyalty to Thaddeus. Gregory's entire speech had been carefully constructed to minimize his agency, to make the affair sound like something that happened to him rather than something he actively chose hundreds of times over 6 months. Malai's response during their final conversation revealed similar strategic thinking. She had cycled through standard responses, testing which approach might work, adjusting her tactics based on his reactions. When she recognized that nothing was working, that Thaddeus had checked out emotionally, she had tried to make his lack of emotional response into the problem. By remaining calm and numb rather than exploding into anger or dissolving into grief, he was somehow failing the relationship, refusing to do the work necessary for healing. This reframing of his response as the real issue rather than her 6-month affair with his friend was a masterclass in manipulation that he could appreciate intellectually even as he rejected it emotionally. About a month after the breakup, Thaddeus ran into them together at a night market in the old city. Malai saw him first, her face registering surprise and something that might have been guilt or concern. Gregory looked uncomfortable, positioning himself slightly behind Malai, as if she might provide protection from Thaddeus's reaction. Thaddeus nodded at them politely, the way he might acknowledge casual acquaintances, and continued walking. Behind him, he heard Malai say his name, but he did not turn around. There was nothing to say. They were strangers who he happened to have history with, and that history was no longer relevant to his present or future. The encounter did spark something approaching emotion, though not the rage or grief that might have been expected. Instead, Thaddeus felt a kind of distant pity for both of them. They had destroyed multiple relationships for an affair that, based on what he heard from other expats, was already showing signs of strain. Gregory apparently resented how much money Malai expected him to provide. Malai apparently complained that Gregory was controlling and jealous, constantly questioning where she was and who she talked to. The relationship that had seemed worth betraying friendship and primary partnership for was turning out to be disappointing and drama-filled. This should have provided satisfaction, some sense of karmic justice. Instead, Thaddeus felt nothing beyond mild intellectual interest in how predictable their problems were. By month 2 post-breakup, Thaddeus had developed a routine that excluded both Malai and Gregory from his life. He avoided places he knew they frequented. He stopped attending expat events where they might appear. He built a new social circle from scratch, meeting people through language exchange groups and volunteer activities. When people in these new circles asked about his relationship status, he said he was single and not looking for relationship currently. When pressed, he would mention briefly that he had been in a relationship that ended due to infidelity, but he provided no details and discouraged follow-up questions. The past was done, he told people. He was focused on building a future that did not include romantic entanglement. Several people suggested he must be very hurt to be so closed off to new relationship possibilities. Thaddeus disagreed. He was not hurt. He was informed. He now understood that he lacked the ability to accurately assess romantic partners' honesty and fidelity. His intelligence, which he had relied on throughout his life, was useless in detecting sustained emotional deception. This was simply data about his own limitations. Given this data, the logical response was to avoid situations where such limitations could be exploited. Staying single was a rational choice based on evidence of his own vulnerability to manipulation. This answer troubled people more than expressions of hurt or anger would have. There was something unsettling about his clinical detachment, his treatment of profound personal betrayal as merely data to be incorporated into future decision-making. But Thaddeus could not generate the emotional displays people seemed to expect. The numbness that had settled over him in the immediate aftermath of the confession had never lifted. He existed behind a wall of protective disconnection that kept him functional but emotionally isolated. Around month 3, Thaddeus received an unexpected message from Malai. She said she wanted to apologize properly, not for her own benefit, but because he deserved a genuine acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. She asked whether they could meet for coffee somewhere public and neutral. Thaddeus deleted the message without responding. A week later, she tried again, this time saying she was not trying to get back together or justify what she did. She just wanted the chance to say sorry face to face. Again, Thaddeus deleted without responding. After the third message along similar lines, he blocked her number. He understood what she was doing. The relationship with Gregory was likely failing, and she was either attempting to keep Thaddeus as a backup option or needing his forgiveness to feel better about herself. Either way, her request for a meeting served her interests, not his. He had nothing to gain from hearing another iteration of her apology. The facts of what happened would not change. His response to those facts would not change. A meeting would simply provide her a platform to perform remorse and test whether he had softened enough to potentially reconsider the breakup. He had not and would not, so meeting was pointless. Gregory also attempted contact, though less frequently. A single email arriving around month 4, long and detailed, explaining his thought process during the affair and its aftermath. He had been lonely, he wrote, and Malai had provided attention and excitement that his life was otherwise lacking. He had rationalized the betrayal by telling himself that Thaddeus would never know, that what happened separately from Thaddeus did not affect Thaddeus. But guilt had eaten at him until confession became the only option. He hoped Thaddeus understood that the confessions itself was an act of respect, of valuing their friendship enough to choose honesty over comfortable lies. Thaddeus read this email once and felt the same numbness that characterized his response to everything connected to the betrayal. Gregory was attempting to reconstruct their friendship by framing his confession as brave honesty rather than self-serving guilt relief. The email asked Thaddeus to consider all the good times they had shared, to weigh 19 months of genuine friendship against 6 months of deception. It suggested that Thaddeus's refusal to engage in conversation about what happened was itself a kind of cruelty, a denial of Gregory's humanity and capacity for growth. Thaddeus deleted the email and added Gregory to his spam filter. By month 6, Thaddeus had fully adapted to his new life structure. He lived alone, socialized strategically to avoid isolation while maintaining emotional distance, and spent significant time on solo activities like reading, hiking, and photography. He had no romantic prospects and did not seek any. The numbness had become normal, his baseline emotional state. He experienced contentment during good meals or beautiful sunsets, irritation when dealing with bureaucracy or traffic, but nothing approaching the depth of feeling he remembered from before the betrayal. It was as though his capacity for strong emotion had been damaged beyond repair. Some people would call this depression, and perhaps they would be right. But Thaddeus did not feel depressed. He felt protected. The numbness that others found concerning functioned as armor against future harm, Chusarm. If he could not feel strongly about anything, then nothing could hurt him. This seemed like an evolutionary adaptation, a psychological development that would prevent him from making similar mistakes. His logical mind approved of this emotional shutdown, even as some distant part of him recognized it might not be healthy. He thought about the affair in analytical terms as a case study in human deception and self-deception. Malai had maintained simultaneous relationships for 6 months, which required sustained effort and planning. Every time she was with Thaddeus, she was performing. Every expression of affection was strategic, designed to maintain his investment while she pursued her actual interests elsewhere. This level of sustained deception required either psychopathic lack of empathy or strong compartmentalization abilities. Either way, it suggested Thaddeus had fundamentally misread her character from the beginning. He had believed he was dating someone honest and straightforward, because he wanted to believe this, and she had provided just enough genuine-seeming behavior to support his preferred narrative. Gregory's betrayal operated on different mechanics. He had been Thaddeus's friend genuinely, or at least Thaddeus believed the friendship had been genuine before Malai's introduction. The affair represented a calculation that potential sexual and romantic satisfaction outweighed loyalty to friendship. Gregory had made this calculation repeatedly over 6 months, choosing each time that his desires were more important than Thaddeus's right to honest treatment. The confession, whatever Gregory's stated motives, had been about Gregory's need to relieve guilt, not about protecting Thaddeus from ongoing deception. If protecting Thaddeus had been the goal, Gregory could have ended the affair months earlier and never told Thaddeus it happened. Instead, he participated for 6 months and then confessed when the guilt became personally intolerable. Both betrayals shared a common element that Thaddeus found philosophically interesting. Both betrayers had treated him as an object in their world, rather than a subject with his own experience and worth. Malai had treated him as a resource to be managed while pursuing her actual interests. Gregory had treated him as an obstacle to be navigated around while pursuing Malai. Neither had considered his internal experience, his feelings, his trust as factors worthy of significant weight in their decision-making. He had been less a person to them than a problem to solve or situation to manage. This realization contributed to the numbness. If the people closest to him viewed him as merely a source of resources or an obstacle to their desires, then authentic connection was impossible. He would always be performing for an audience that viewed him instrumentally rather than as fully human. This was not a sustainable basis for intimate relationships. Better to remain alone than to invest emotional energy in people who did not and would not reciprocate genuine care for his well-being. Friends from his new social circle occasionally suggested therapy, gently noting that his emotional flatness and resistance to new relationships seemed like trauma responses worth addressing. Thaddeus agreed intellectually that therapy might be beneficial, but he could not generate enough concern about his emotional state to actually schedule appointments. The numbness extended to concern about the numbness itself. He was functional, solvent, physically healthy. His emotional disconnection did not seem like an urgent problem requiring intervention. Around month 8, one of his new friends named Patricia was direct enough to say what others had been dancing around. She told him he seemed like a ghost, physically present but not actually there. He was going through motions of life without appearing to experience any of it. When he smiled or laughed, it looked performed rather than felt. She worried he was missing out on genuine connection and joy because he had walled himself off after one bad relationship experience. Yes, the betrayal had been terrible, but staying numb forever was not healing. It was avoidance. Thaddeus appreciated her honesty even as he rejected her analysis. He was not avoiding healing. He had simply accepted certain realities about his own limitations and adjusted his life accordingly. Healing implied recovery to previous function, but he had no desire to return to the vulnerability that characterized his pre-betrayal state. That vulnerability had been exploited, had left him open to sustained manipulation. His current numb state was not a problem to solve, but an adaptation to lived experience. He told Patricia this, and she looked at him with something like sadness before changing the subject. 1 year after the confession, Thaddeus took stock of his life in a systematic way. Financially stable, living comfortably on his pension. Physically healthy for a 66-year-old, maintaining fitness through regular hiking and yoga. Socially connected enough to avoid isolation, though not deeply close to anyone. Emotionally stable in the sense of experiencing no extreme highs or lows. No romantic relationships, no prospects, no desire for any. By most objective measures, his life was fine. He should have been satisfied with this assessment. Instead, he felt nothing in particular about it. He had learned lessons from the affair, though whether they were the right lessons remained unclear. Trust is dangerous. Emotional investment makes you vulnerable to exploitation. Logic and intelligence do not protect against emotional manipulation. Age gap relationships have inherent power imbalances that create opportunities for deception. Friends can betray you as easily as romantic partners. Confessions often serve the confessor's interests rather than the betrayed person's well-being. These lessons seemed true based on his experience, yet they also seemed to lead toward isolation and cynicism that might not serve his long-term well-being. The numbness persisted. He existed in a state of emotional suspension, unable to care deeply about anything, but also unable to end the suspension. It was as though the betrayal had broken something in his emotional processing that could not be repaired. He understood intellectually that this was probably unhealthy, that he should probably seek professional help, that continuing indefinitely in this state would result in a diminished and disconnected life. But understanding something intellectually did not provide motivation to change it. The numbness protected him from pain, and he had no desire to trade protection for vulnerability, even if vulnerability might allow for richer emotional experience. For anyone reading this who finds themselves in a similar situation, who discovers that someone they trusted has been betraying them for months, who receives a confession from a friend who participated in that betrayal, here is what I learned. The numbness is real. The emotional shutdown that follows overwhelming betrayal is a protective mechanism, but it may also be a trap. If you find yourself unable to feel anything weeks or months after the betrayal, if you notice that nothing touches you emotionally anymore, this is worth addressing even if it does not feel urgent, because the alternative is spending years or decades behind a wall of protective disconnection, alive but not fully living. 6 months of sustained betrayal involving your partner and friend is not a mistake or lapse in judgment. It is hundreds of choices, hundreds of moments where they decided their wants mattered more than your well-being. When someone confesses to this kind of sustained deception, they are not necessarily doing you a favor or being brave. Often they are seeking relief from guilt that serves their emotional needs rather than protecting you. Accept that their confession is about them, not you, and make your decisions accordingly. Logic and intelligence will not protect you from emotional manipulation. In fact, intelligence can be a liability because it allows you to construct elaborate explanations for suspicious behavior, to explain away red flags, to believe comfortable lies because they make rational sense. Trust your gut when it tells you something is wrong, even if you cannot logically prove it. Investigate suspicions rather than explaining them away. And if you discover betrayal, leave. Do not waste emotional energy on people who have demonstrated they view you instrumentally rather than valuing you for yourself. The numbness remains a year later. Perhaps it always will. Perhaps this is who I am now. someone who experienced betrayal significant enough to permanently alter their emotional baseline. That feels true as I write this, sitting in my apartment in Chiang Mai, watching the city wake up outside my window. The same balcony where I received Gregory's confession, though I have moved to a different building since then. Different location, same numbness, same protective disconnection that keeps me functional but isolated. It remains unclear whether this is healing or damage, adaptation or trauma, protection or prison. All I know for certain is that I trusted two people who betrayed me comprehensively, and I will never trust anyone that completely again. The numbness ensures this. Whether that is wisdom or tragedy, I honestly cannot say.